Senior U.S. military officials are admitting that the Ukrainian counteroffensive is not meeting expectations on any front. Sources told CNN this week that Ukraine's push is having less success and Russian forces are showing more competence than Western assessments expected.
Despite what the headlines in the Western media may suggest, Ukraine's chances of victory this year are, quote, vanishingly small, as retired Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis and friend of the show recently wrote. Joining us now to elaborate is Lieutenant Colonel Davis himself. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So this seems like a relatively new assessment. General Mark Milley has recently sort of provided more sober analysis of the chances of Ukraine winning this war. What has led to this diminished optimism?
What's happened on the battlefield, the actual results of the fighting, but it's a little concerning to me because, I've been on your show many times this year. We've been talking about this very issue, about the capacity of the Russian defenses and the capacity of the Ukrainian armed forces to actually attack into it. And for very fundamental and practical reasons, this outcome should have been entirely predictable. So it shouldn't have caught anyone by surprise, but it does appear that it has, as you saw that CNN report there, and that just shows that there is some concern that they're now coming to realize that the capacity to win the war on the ground for Ukraine does not appear to even be there, nor will it be for the foreseeable future. And it remains to be seen if that now changes the calculus on both the United States and the Western allies and how we approach this.
So how much of this shift do you credit to the recent flooding in Ukraine, and how much of it do you credit to Ukraine just not having the military capacity to fight off Russian forces?
I actually think the flooding is completely inconsequential to the fighting. It didn't help it. It didn't hurt it. It was a horrible ecological disaster and just devastated a lot of people's lives, but it doesn't really affect the fighting because it's really all in different directions and what's going on there. The real problem, and really part of it's math. According to General Milley last week, he said that there was somewhere around 300,000 Russians defending within the borders of Ukraine along that 1,000-kilometer front. Into that, you're trying to launch an attack force of somewhere between, depending on who you want to believe, 30 and 50,000 Ukrainian troops. And of course, as we've also talked about many times, that's a hodgepodge of different Western countries, Soviet stuff that they've had a long time, that they've had some minimal training on. And then you're trying to go into a defense that's had more than half a year and 9 months in some places to prepare for that offensive. And you're just asking something of the Ukraine side that's just fundamentally unfair to even think that they're going to succeed. And so far, that's precisely how it's worked out on the ground.
We learned yesterday as well that Ukraine had apparently struck a key bridge leading to Crimea. At least that's what Russia said. At this point, do you think the Ukrainians have the appetite or the ability to give up the idea of taking back Crimea before they go to the table for negotiations?
Well, they're loath to do that. They have hated it. I believe as recently as 48 hours ago, Zelensky again emphatically repeated that he's not even going to negotiate, not even going to talk to Russia until all of their troops are gone out of all of Ukrainian territory, which is, of course, is just not going to happen. It's not realistic in the least. So up to this point, they have not yet acknowledged that. And as you can tell by the continued just wave after wave of assaults on several places, at least 5 along the front lines, Ukraine continues to attack, as they're doing again today. So they have not given up anything, and they're still just trying to beat their head against that brick wall. The question is going to be how many more times can they hit that brick wall before they lose the striking power and they don't have enough to conduct offensive operations. Then you have a separate problem in that now then they become vulnerable to a Russian counterattack because they may not have enough offensive defense capacity to even hold off against that. But that's still to be seen.
So we had former President Barack Obama in an interview with CNN's Christiane Amanpour on Thursday defend his position with regard to Russia's annexation of Crimea back in 2014. And he maintained that the circumstances were just not the same as they are today, and that Ukraine back then was not the same as the one we see today. Colonel Davis, what do you make of that response from President Obama, former President Obama?
Well, as this show knows, I've been a pretty frequent critic of President Obama's foreign policy on a number of issues. especially both the Iraq and the Afghanistan wars. But I think he's probably right on this one, frankly, because look, we have to recognize that in 2014, there almost was no Ukrainian army. I think that they had like 8,000 or 10,000 total troops that were virtually untrained, and they didn't have, a coherent set of military gear, et cetera. They spent the next 8 years building one, and that's the reason why they have genuinely been very effective at continuing to fight against their much larger neighbor over these 16 months. But at the time, I mean, we shouldn't have gone into the war in 2014. We shouldn't have done it now. So I actually wish we would have done the similar thing to what Obama did then and not become so decisively engaged that we basically have perpetuated this war now for 16 months. And you see, with no rational reason to expect that the Ukraine side is going to succeed, yet we give them enough weapons to hold off defeat and to give them hope for victory. But I argue that that's false hope, and all it's done is cause hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian deaths and the absolute wiping off the map of a number of their cities. And there's no hope for that. And I hope that we now, with this offensive operation having run into a buzzsaw, that we can maybe change our policies.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on that point because the United States, of course, has offered tons of weapons and financial resources to the Ukrainians, but the common narrative from our politicians is that if we just give them more money, then maybe they'll eventually succeed. Do you think there's any dollar amount, or I guess what would the dollar amount that's worth it be in order to help them have some shot at victory? Does that even exist?
I think that if you could say, hey, look, they are right on the edge of success here, and if we just help them a little bit here and it'll push it over the top, there's a rational reason that they could succeed. That would be a different conversation. And then perhaps it makes sense to have that, that kind of support. There's nothing even close to that, though. It would take years to develop a genuine offensive capacity to be able to drive Russia out of Ukraine. And of course, during the same period of time, you'd have the Russians building up even stronger. So any way you want to look at it, there is no rational military path for Ukraine to win back its territories. And of course, Russia has the nuclear trump card. So even in the event that somehow you did take years to do that and you started succeeding, now you have the risk of nuclear escalation, which is in no way, shape, or form in American national interest. So any way you want to look at it, our best interests lie in bringing this war to a conclusion as soon as possible.
What do you make of the common criticism that folks have that there's an obligation to fight off Russia as an imperial power? There's a general understanding that it's an unjust war being waged on behalf of Russia, that it's an imperial action. And I see that from the perspective of, does the U.S. involvement make that better or worse? Are there other avenues to which we can address actions like this? And of course, addressing it from a perspective of international solidarity against imperial actions on the global stage. It's complicated by the reality that Russia has a permanent position on the Security Council and has veto power. It makes it really difficult to solve these sort of situations when they play out on the global stage. What do you make of a peaceful path forward, if possible at all?
Well, I think the word you just used there was the operative one, and that's reality. There is a preference that we have, and the world that we would like to see, to where no one uses force to force anybody else to do anything. There's no imperial ambitions and all of that sort of thing. And those are desires, and many of them are very good. But there's also the reality that exists on the ground. And even though we desire a certain outcome, if the fundamental building blocks that exist, that means both military power, economic power, history, geography, all of those kinds of things have to factor in there. And if you can't get the outcome that you prefer based on all of those factors, then you have to use different actions. And you have to sometimes you have to not even get what you want. And unfortunately, we haven't graduated to that element. We're not dealing in the reality, we're dealing in the preference. And we keep trying to force it onto the geography, onto the history and all those things. And it's just not fitting. And the longer we try to force something into a round peg in a square hole where it'll never fit, people are dying and things are failing, and our security continues to stay at risk. We have to move more to the diplomatic side, to where we acknowledge that sometimes reality means we don't get everything that we want, but we can still use our power and our influence to make things, adequate or good enough. And until we get to that point here, we're going to continue to be frustrated, and so are our allies.
Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, thank you so much for helping us break this down. We'll be back with more Rising after this.
Always my pleasure.